Hello, and welcome to Episode 6 of Series 1, The Peoples of Chult and the Peninsula. I'm your guide, Graham, and this is Lore Diver, the podcast about lore, world building, and alternative takes on the information that we cover. So, what are we doing tonight? Tonight, we are covering Lizardfolk. They've been around forever, but what are they really about? How do they fit into the Forgotten Realms? All good questions, some of which will be answered in this episode as I dive into lore. Now, for years, I've been lukewarm about Lizardfolk. Like full confession here, like full disclosure. I've been lukewarm on them at best, as well as a number of other monster folk, orcs, goblins, all that sort of thing. Largely because they were at the time were relentlessly portrayed terribly, made visually hideous, and the people that I did know who did play them were playing them for shock value. Which like really just sort of put a bad taste in my mouth about the whole thing. This all changed relatively recently, though, thanks to two anime series, Overlord and Restaurant to Another World. These shows took totally different approaches to presenting different types of basically monsters and monster folk, and it just blew my mind and sort of opened the doors up to like more potential in game and all that sort of stuff. And so, with that in mind, let's dive into the lore of Lizardfolk in Chult and on the peninsula. We'll start off with their history through the editions. So, Lizardfolk are one of the oldest monsters in the game. They made their first appearance in 1975 in OD&D with the Greyhawk supplement. And, all of a sudden, Lizard Man, it was an option. They're described as having rude intelligence, which was, just a terminology back in the day to say that they're sort of intelligent, more cunning than intelligent, maybe. Smarter than an animal, not as smart as a person, that sort of thing. And they ate people, and that pretty much set the tone for Lizardfolk for quite a while for a lot of people. And then things start to change a little bit in AD&D. They're back in the monster manual, and the Fiend Folio brings us the Lizard King. And this early Lizard King isn't demonic or abyssal. They're just described as being more human-like and having greater intelligence than a regular lizard man. And the regular lizard men serve them. And there's notes in it about how the Lizard King will eat 2 lizard men for every day that they don't have a human to eat, which strikes me as like a really bad way to maintain any sort of population base. If you're literally eating 2 of the people that are serving you every single day because they didn't bring a human for you to eat, that's just bad policy. So that was Lizard Kings. But interestingly, and this is during sort of the Wild West days in the hobby. This is the 80s, all that sort of good stuff. There's a lot of publications going on that were advertising and supporting games that were technically in competition with them, or they were just putting out information sort of willy-nilly. And White Dwarf, in issue number 81, is the first time that a playable lizard man race is presented. However, it's completely unofficial, so it's just sort of a neat footnote, but that's how early people were like, hey, I want to play a lizard man. This looks cool to me. And that's, that's saying something, given at the time, that wasn't really a thing yet. People were still really happy just with the conventional handful of races. So things carry on with, oddly, and I seldom go here, basic Beckme, the basic enhanced champion, all that sort of stuff. So basic D&D presented them as a playable race in their Hollow World supplement in 1990. This seems unusual, but it's actually not, because as weird as Mystara was, and like as problematic as parts of it definitely are, the people who are making it were much less inhibited by ideas of what people wanted to play than the teams that were working on AD&D. And so, I mean, like, they had playable orcs, playable hobgoblins, playable gnolls, all that sort of stuff, way before AD&D did. And Lizardman was one of the groups that they did. And in fact, they actually expanded on it during the Voyage of the Princess Ark saga series sort of thing. It was like the swan song of the entire basic set. They introduced the Cayman, CAY-men, super creative naming there, and crocodile type lizard folk. They actually expanded the types of lizard folk out and then gave them a civilization and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it was really kind of cool that they were going there. And like, it's not perfect, it's got all sorts of problems, but this is the first appearance in a D&D product, a TSR product, of the Lizardman as a playable race. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. And of course, if you want to read about some of this stuff, you can check it out. It's in the 1992 issue of Dragon Magazine, number 185. So, second edition rolls out. Second edition sees TSR, Gary Gygax is gone, for better or for worse, and TSR is desperately trying to branch out and try to figure out what people want while trying to maintain market dominance. It's not really working out too well. But they finally start twigging to the idea that people want to play something else. That halfling, elf, dwarf, human, half-elf is not gnome, is not a completely sufficient list anymore. And, they see what happens with the 1990 Hollow World book, and they're like, okay, we got to get on this. And so 1992 sees the very first time that Lizardfolk are available as an official player's race for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in the Spelljammer's Complete Spacefarer's Handbook. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, it doesn't make any sense to me either. I have no idea why they would throw Lizardfolk into outer space, but that's where they went with it. And this was apparently successful enough that it was followed up in the Complete Humanoids Handbook, and then again in the Player's Options Skills and Power book. So, like, this is moving from setting specific to being a broad spectrum. Like, yep, this is available. If there's Lizardmen in this setting, go for it. Now, the downside, of course, was, like, at the time they had the usual level cap and class access restrictions, but it's how it went down. So let's see, I got a question here. Put Lizardfolk into space to compete with the White Dwarf games. Yeah, that's very possible. White Dwarf and Games Workshop does have the Lizardman and faction in the Warhammer setting, so Warhammer Fantasy. So it may have indeed been in response to that. I'm not sure though. That is a good question. Now, in terms of Chult and Tomb of Annihilation, scaling this back to the whole purpose of this series, they weren't strictly available as a player race yet. Let's be honest here, second edition was not geared at all to the idea of non-human, non-demi-human players or storylines for the overwhelming bulk of the settings in this edition. However, they are mentioned specifically as being present in Chult, and there's even some early hints that there's some sort of link between them and the Terrafolk, which I'll be covering next week. So what it boiled down to with second edition was, if your DM was cool with it, and if you had the books, Lizardman was an available player race, then it had a place in Chult, albeit an undescribed one. They were simply one more monster in the background for people to encounter. There was one more big thing that happened, though, in second edition, and that was the release of the Monster Mythology book. It was an accessory for the DM, so it was one of those gray-colored splat books. And in this, the Lizardfolk got a much-needed cultural update, because they hadn't had anything. Like, there was no love going their way whatsoever. And they got it in the form of a theological update with Samuanya? Yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced. Being their main deity. And their deity is all about survival. And that's it. Survive. Samuanya isn't even assigned a gender. So it is an actual, like, an agender or genderless deity, or perhaps both genders or multiple genders at once. because that is a very possible thing with reptiles. They can even change gender, and sex. So that was their main deity, and they barely got involved with the day-to-day lives of lizard folk unless there was a major threat. If there was a major threat, something that was going to like possibly destroy a lizard folk community, then it became a very direct action. Like S1E6 would materialize, drop an avatar on site, and just beat down whatever was going on, which is pretty awesome. The other neat thing was that they're neutral, and that's a huge point that I need to make here, is that lizard folk and lizard men through most editions have always been presented as neutral. They're treated as evil, largely because they consider anything that's not lizard folk as a potential food source. But they're actually neutral. Like, they're not evil, they're not malign, they are simply part of nature. So, S1E6 is introduced, and so is S1E6. And S1E6 is a demon lord who is tired of the blood wars and is looking to get some power elsewhere, and is basically trying to pull a Yeenoghu. And Yeenoghu is the demon lord who successfully co-opted all the gnolls and turned them into his own little personal power source. And this is more or less what S1E6 is trying to do. And it lists him as the source of the previously non-abyssal lizard kings. And so all of a sudden now he's the source of these smarter ones, and it's how he's trying to bring the lizard folk over, and it's not working out well for him. Very low success rate, of getting his lizard kings into positions of power as well. And then there's sort of a neat note in the Monstrous Compendium that some lizard folk have evolved and live in crude huts and have more complex social structures. So they're at least throwing a bone to people who want to play lizard folk at this point, saying, okay, maybe they aren't all just a bunch of, mindless people-eating pop-up targets for adventurers to attack. They're going to give them something to start from, which is kind of nice. A comment here, they're not trying to take over the world, they're just not very picky eaters. Exactly. Not picky eaters at all. So, 3 and 3.5 edition D&D. This is where they realize, okay, people like it, let's do it up. People like playing scaly things. They like playing lizard folk. They like playing dragon people. 3rd edition and 3.5 realize, accept this finally, and start doing something with the lizard folk, and it's fantastic. So at this point, they realize this, and so upgrades in life everywhere. In the Monster Manual, there's a shift between 3 and 3.5. The original one simply 3rd edition book simply has a note that they're available as a player race, and says that they prefer to be druids, and then lists what spheres their clerics and druids prefer. Not a lot of information, but hey, at least it says that, lizard folk are available as a player race. 3.5's Monster Manual, though, pours fuel on the fire and gives us kind of full stat block for a player race usage that, in all honesty, I wish had been perpetuated forwards through 4th and 5th editions. Like, if it looks like something that people are going to play, don't leave people hanging. Like, just provide a little stat block like they did in 3.5. It's like, oh, hey, you want to play this? Here's their ability score modifiers. Here's their natural abilities. Here's anything else that you need to know about them. And then if there's any sort of like level adjustment or something like that going on, here's that information. I wish that had carried on forwards, because it's a fantastic thing. It doesn't take up much space, and it just saves a ton of time for the DM and players when you get someone who wants to play something and there's no stats available for it, so you end up having to try to homebrew up something. So yeah, just a little segue there. Wish they kept on doing that. They didn't. Makes me very sad. So that's the Monster Manuals. And then the Serpent Kingdoms book comes in, and like the Serpent Kingdoms book for the scaled races part of this series is a virtual Bible. It is packed with a ton of lore for the Forgotten Realms, is directly applicable to Chult and the Peninsula. It is some serious information that will make your game in that area better. And this is where they get linked to the Surrak. They get a history as slaves, as warriors, and mercenaries. They're finally given some depth of character and a place in the world and how they've interacted with it, and it's phenomenal. And then, it goes into overdrive with S1E6. And there's Lizard Kings and Queens, and they're not only are they trying to like seduce, not seduce, but trying to like convince, well, I guess seduce technically, Lizardfolk over to their side, but they're also desperately trying to, establish their own little micro kingdoms and trying to, be abyssal and evil, and Lizardfolk underneath them, or they are the vicious, monstrous Lizardfolk of previous editions, which is the best way I think to describe it. Whereas the Lizardfolk from the monster manuals that are available as player races are generally from places that aren't under the influence of these Lizard Kings and Queens. Then there's a whole bunch of like micronations and domains scattered across Faerun, that are either, well, they're described as in, like, they'll say, oh, there's a kingdom of Lizardfolk, or there's a city of Lizardfolk in fill in the blank, but then there's nothing else. And this is a problem that I've talked about before, where, they'll talk about a monstrous race having an empire, a kingdom, or some other form of civilization, and then never expand on it, and just sort of leave it blank, because, who cares about that? We're here to get involved in the politics of dwarves and elves and junk like that. So, a little disappointing there, but, it's there. They have complex civilizations, they have complex societies, they have cities, they have nations. They should be an integrated part of the Forgotten Realms, but like so many other monsters, they are not. Another implied thing is potential conflict with bullywugs and the amphibious races, because they operate in and prefer the same bioecological climatic zones. So like the same, biomes and conditions are what they both crave, and they are mutually exclusive. Like they cannot coexist well together, largely because, as described, like bullywugs and those groups are voracious consumers of everything, who do not try to maintain their lands and territories in a way that lets them, be what's the word for it? Sustained. Like they don't do sustained ecosystems. Whereas Lizardfolk, based on the fact they love druids and all that sort of thing as a preferred class, that's probably what they're all about, is more of the sustained ecosystem. And yeah, so this marks probably this will be the high water mark for Lizardfolk and their development in pretty much any sort of way or fashion. And we go to 4th edition, where they dial it back, dump the lizards, and give us dragons instead. So yeah, 4th edition. 4th edition doing what 4th edition does. They dropped the Lizardfolk as a playable race like a hot rock. There's no official support for them that I've been able to locate, at least, to play them. There's lots of stuff happening behind the scenes, though, if you pay attention. And by this I mean, like, 4th edition, I'm finding increasingly, as I'm being forced to read through more of its material for these episodes, there's a lot of really sort of like mixed messages going on in it, in that like they'll support the Surrak and Lizardfolk lore-wise and actually have them developing and becoming a major factor in various parts of the world, but then they won't make them available as a player race. It's like they brought that wall back up between monster folk and regular folk, and said, okay, if it's monster, it's over here. If it's not, it's over here. With, I believe, I believe gnolls were an exception to that. I think, yeah, there was a gnoll supplement that gave information on how to play gnolls, which is one of the rare instances in 4th edition that I've seen where a monster race was given a chance to be a player race as well. But, you know, they're described in this edition as having formed the nation of Iliamar, which I mentioned the other day with the Suruk in the Suruk episode. And they're maintaining or even expanding other holdings, which is pretty cool. And this is all in the campaign setting book. And their ties to the Suruk are actually deepened in a few cases where they seem to have been like re-co-opted by their former masters to, you know, be professional lizard folk, and they're more powerful. They have more powerful magic, and there's no lizard kings. And this is all good stuff, but like that's as far as the edition goes. So it's kind of it's weird going through 4th edition, and it just seems to be getting weirder and weirder the more I get into it. You keep seeing like these little strings of ideas where they seem to have had a plan for where they wanted to go with the edition, but then decided, nope, can't do this, you know, full stop, back off. So it's weird. Now, 5th edition, they're back in the saddle, sort of. So Lizardfolk have made their triumphant return in Vol's Guide to Monsters, along with a short write-up on them that, frankly, like in my opinion, regresses them back towards like 1st edition or OD&D in many ways. You know, they're alien-minded, they might eat you, you know, you can never understand them. And I get part of that. Like, yes, you know, they are reptilian, so yeah, they're probably going to have a different way of thinking and a different point of view on the world. But on the other hand, you know, they are intelligent, they're sapient, they're sentient, they're capable of understanding the world around them, they can use magic, they can do all these other sorts of things. So I feel that the lack of cultural development and sophistication presented with them was a real disservice and a real sort of like missed beat. But that's where we are in 5th edition. At least they are back, and that's something. Now, their history in the campaign setting. This is a pretty wild action here. So they're created at some point. Couldn't find an actual date for it, but they're created at some point during the Days of Thunder by the Suruk. And that's all you really know about them. They're one of the many races created by the Suruk. The Suruk don't seem to care too much about them. Like they really sort of go hard for the Yuan-Ti, and they'll use Lizardfolk when like they're going off to war. But for the most part, they seem to just sort of create them and then leave them. And for millennia, that's sort of they're just doing their own thing. And then in 1732, or sorry, minus 1732 Day of Reckoning, the Yuan-Ti are having issues. The Lapal have broken free of their control. They're going off to form their own human lands, and the Yuan-Ti need more slaves because Yuan-Ti aren't going to do regular work. That's for suckers, right? So they import huge numbers. Well, they probably did import and probably captured large numbers of Lizardfolk slaves from the great swamp of Ruthgild, so just on the other side of modern Helrua. And upon reaching the shores of the Lapal Sea, many of the Lizardfolk either immediately escaped or were released on purpose into territory claimed by the Thingoth humans. So essentially, the plan appeared to be that the Yuan-Ti realized, okay, we're not going to be able to control all of them. We've lost some, so let's just release them into these human lands and hope they wreak enough havoc that they'll weaken our now ancient enemies, the Thingoth humans. So things kind of suck for the Thingoth, and I think this sort of may have worked both ways. In that you have suddenly, yes, there are lizard folk, and they are now competing with the Thingoth humans for territory and space. However, they want the marshy, terrible places that humans don't generally want to live in because, nobody likes being eaten alive by giant D&D style mosquitoes all the time. And so I think this, this may have turned into an issue where they were dealing with both Thingoth and lizard folk at times. So this goes on to, literally nearly 1,000 years pass, over 1,000 years pass, and in minus 189 DR, the year of the Sunned Serpents, which is a pretty badass name. The Lizardfolk and Yuan Ti armies of Serpentes, so basically Lizardfolk warrior slaves being commanded by Yuan Ti, complete their conquest of the Tashalar. And now at this point, the Tashalar area had both Tashlans in it, and it had a large number of Kalashites in it. And the Kalashites bombshell out of there. Like, they get out and run off. They don't want anything to do with this. And I don't blame them. Like, nobody wants to be ruled by the Yuan Ti. And, like, that's a serious event. And then in 285 DR, the year of wasteful pride, the Shun Imperium, and now the Shun Imperium is the Kalashite Empire. Like, it was the biggest one. It held the most ground for the longest, and is criminally underused in the setting, period. It seizes control of La Palia, and then begins a sweep down the peninsula. So they're heading westwards and into Thindol, where you have the Thinguth and what's left of the Serpentes, and of course lots of Lizardfolk, and immediately come into conflict with the Lizardfolk there. And the Lizardfolk see a sharp decline in their numbers. So try hard, do not fully succeed in 285, but in 293, Dale Reckoning, the Year of the Hounds, the Thinguth are liberated when the soldiers of the Shun Empire defeat Lizardfolk tribes. So, yeah, I don't really know where to go with this, because the Lizardfolk are never described as being a slaveholding or conquest-oriented group, like, ever. They're always really described as kind of being semi-isolationist, if not completely isolationist, and just wanting to do their own thing. So the idea that they were somehow maintaining control over the Thinguth doesn't really hold water with me. Like, it doesn't track well. But that is actually the last year that Lizardfolk, at least in this area, have any sort of serious mention. And that leaps us right to the current state of the campaign setting. So this is in or about 1491, 1492 Dale Reckoning, and there's just been so many mischances all over the place with the Lizardfolk going on. In a remarkable twofer, the Lizardfolk were left out of the Tomb of Annihilation in any sort of serious way. Only mentioned as having kingdoms under the thrall of lizard kings and queens in the Valley of Dread. But then no support outside of a short description in the monster manual about their situation with Semuiana and Ses-Innik. And this is a huge issue, because if you look even at the maps that were provided for the Tomb of Annihilation, they include the Valley of Dread. It is a named part of the area. And if there are literal kingdoms of Lizardfolk there that are under the thrall of Ses-Innik and his Lizard Kings and Lizard Queens, that is some serious action happening. Like, that's something that, people should be very concerned about, because Ses-Innik is a demon lord who was originally listed as having demigod level powers, and is clearly now above that if they have multiple kingdoms, like 2 or 3 kingdoms in the Valley of Dread. And the Valley of Dread is also giving it larger context. The Valley of Dread is part of leads to the Chultangar area, and it's sort of the crossover point between Thindol, like the lighter jungles and the plains and coastal plains of Thindol, and Chult itself. So this is like your entryway. If you're coming by land to get to Chult, you have to go through Thindol, you have to go through these places, and there's no information about them except for that there are kingdoms there, and they're ruled by abyssal lizard kings and queens, which are basically tieflings on steroids that are based on lizard folk. So like that was a huge swing and a miss there. And then in the more recent Saltmarsh book, there's an entire like settlement and, not nation quite yet, but, domain held by Lizardfolk in it, where there's sort of like, they're important to the plot of the connected stories and adventures and stuff like that, but everything's happening from the perspective of the people in Saltmarsh. There's nothing from the Lizardfolk perspective, and they've got some of the most serious plot points. Like it's their former home that was captured by the Shahagwin and sunk beneath waves. I probably should have said spoilers there. So yeah, if you haven't played Saltmarsh yet, sorry, there's going to be some spoilers here. But it was their old home that was captured by the Shahagwin and sunk under the waves, which forced them to like go back into the swamps to an older place. They're the ones who are trying to like get weapons and equipment because they need to clear these Shahagwin out before they cause more problems. Like they are a pivotal part of so much in the book, but there's nothing given for them. Like there's no information and about like running the adventure from their perspective. So it's a real loss. And so in many ways right now, for the current state of things, as far as Lizardfolk go in the campaign setting and in Chult in the area, is that we have to go back to 4th edition. We have to look at what they were saying and what they were doing then, and then extrapolate from that how much of that is intact and how much of that is what's going on. And at least in the case of the Valley of Dread, S1E6 plans seem to actually be working. And if that doesn't terrify you, it really should, because Lizardfolk are pound for pound much tougher than gnolls, and if they are successfully brought into the worship of abyssal demons, and specifically S1E6, they are going to wreck the place. Like, there's no two ways about it. Like, it is going to be bad news on a level that the realms, and specifically like that part of the realms, is not geared for in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, that's where things are sort of sitting right now with that. So now the fun part, my take on how things could be done to integrate the Lizardfolk more effectively into your Tomb of Annihilation or into your Chult Peninsula based campaign or adventure. And I think the Lizardfolk have a lot more potential than they're being given credit for within the canon materials. And in many ways, I think the Lizardfolk occupy a similar position in the region to that of orcs up in the north. They're a significant population, and they're intelligent. So they are arguably, next to the goblins, the Batiri goblins in Chult proper, probably the most populous monstrous race and like monsterfolk race in the region. But where they differ, though, is that they don't, unlike the orcs in the north, they don't have an insane deity driving them to attack everything else in a self-destructive pattern of behavior. Like, Grumsh is the worst god. Well, not the worst. He's one of the worst gods out there, and they don't have that. Like, S1E6 is like, yeah, survive. That's my goal for you. Go. They also aren't as powerfully controlled by the Sirak or the Yuan Ti as the other scaled races are, which opens up a lot of other potential doors. So let's look at some options. First off, S1E6. S1E6 is one of the coolest monstrous deities I've seen, because having such a central edict, survive, is so gloriously broad a directive to give your followers, and gives so many amazing options. And like the immediate impulse, with me as well as many other people and the people who designed this game, was that survival equals primitive survival. But that's a super basic take in a world where magic exists. And how I see this is that the Lizardfolk would probably be one of the least predictable races on the planet, largely because every major settlement of them is going to be different. I see them as being amazingly and wonderfully complex and having wildly different relationships with, and types of magic, technology, social structures, and everything else like that, and it all being highly localized because it's what's allowing that group of lizard folk to survive best in their area. So lizard folk in Chult would be different from lizard folk in Findle, which would be different from lizard folk in Retheld, which would be different from lizard folk in Chellenber, and like each group would be, it would be culture shock constantly. If you were an adventurer and you were used to the lizard folk up north in the Sword Coast, and you came to Chult thinking you knew about lizard folk, it would turn out all you really knew about them was that they were lizard folk. That was it. You wouldn't know, like, their culture, their technology, their magic would all be wildly different. Okay, and with new threats, challenges, and experiences constantly feeding into this, their drive is to survive. Their god has told them, survive. And so even something as, comparatively minor to us as, lizard folk witness a battle between adventurers and monsters, and they see the adventurers using all sorts of crazy magic and different tactics, that could lead to changes in the local lizard folk life path and behavioral paths. Like, it could result in a complete change within a few weeks to a few months to immediately, if it's serious enough. And, sort of expanding on that, if you have, say, like, there's lizard folk in Halrua and those places, they're living in, like, a magic intense area with magical humans all over the place. If they need to survive, they need to learn how to survive under those conditions. And so they're going to have some pretty wild arcane magic going on. Got a comment here. Lizards will learn to survive with other species and for symbiotic relationships. Yes, that's one of the points I'll be hitting coming up. That's a huge one. Okay, but yeah, like, they should be different. Like, each group should be different. Each group should reflect the risks, hazards, and dangers around them, and potentially, like, if your characters interact with them enough, may change according to stuff they're encountering through the campaign. Or if you, say, return there and it's 5 years have passed, and you go back to that lizard folk village that you knew, it might be wildly different. Next, battling for the very soul of their people. So Samoania is distant and cold. Okay, but lizard folk also aren't stupid. They've seen what Yeenoghu did to the gnolls, and they want no part in that. As a result, some lizard folk groups and adventurers may be researching for a way to cleanse their people of the taint of S1E6 and block his influences. So, like, you want to play some lizard folk paladins? You want to have some lizard folk clerics and druids, like, out trying to, like, have a reason for them to be adventuring out and about? That is a reason right there. Okay? Lizard folk are not stupid. They're not animals. They are intelligent. They are just reptiles. And reptiles will recognize a bad deal when they see it. And S1E6 is a bad deal. And within my estimation, my guess is that S1E6 was able to get an inroad with the lizard folk probably because they were trying to get 100% free of the Suruk, and probably at that point did not understand the implications of working with the Abyss, and then figured it out and stopped it, or came up with some way of at least holding off S1E6's immediate influences. And so figuring out how to stop him or kill him or do something would be might be fairly high on lizard folk adventurers or lizard folk temples list of things to do. Okay, another one, slaves before, slaves again. Okay, the Suruk are coming back, and they're flexing their authority. Some lizard folk are falling in line, but will they all? So Yuan-Ti have already proven that they cannot control all the lizard folk. Like, that's just not a thing that's been working out well for them. And the Suruk seem to have a mixed relationship with them, in that with the Yuan-Ti, they have the ability to command them directly and, like, get into their dreams and make them do whatever they want. But with lizard folk, it seems the lizard folk follow them more because it's one of those they're strong, they're the strongest, they will help us survive. So that's falling into that whole survival thing I was talking about earlier. And, so this is a big question, especially for Chult, because there's a lot of lizard folk there. And some have fallen to S1E6. Will other ones be going back over to the Suruk? Will some, turn against both? Who knows? These are good questions, things to look into. Marines and mercenaries. Yeah, so lizard folk are tough, they're good fighters, and they love water. In southern lands, finding them serving as mercenaries or marines should be an absolute norm. And personally, I find the idea of lizard folk marines to be absolutely terrifying. They're semi-aquatic, they can hold their breath for 15 minutes or something like that. And the idea of these, of having a whole bunch of these serving on your ship as marines, or having them be dropped off by a man of war, or privateers, or pirates to soften up a port before an attack, is some pretty scary stuff. That's nobody wants to deal with that. Nobody should have to deal with that. But that's something that I think should be a fairly normal event that you'd see in the south of Faerun, so all the warmer areas, especially around coasts or swamps or deltas, that sort of thing. So in Chult and the Peninsula, lizard folk, they have a mixed reputation and would have a very complex relationship with the other peoples of the land. They're imported as slaves and as warrior slaves by the Yuan-Ti of Serpentes, and used in their war of conquest across the peninsula. And a large number are now under the thrall of lizard kings and queens. So, they are... Every different group is going to have different opinions of them, and how they interact with them and whatnot is going to vary wildly, and it may depend greatly on the individual lizard folk that they're encountering. And so I think that in the northern areas of the peninsula, you're probably going to have the best relationships. So this is up around Port Nyanzaru, and pretty much everything that is west of the Orlungo River and so on. And I say this because they're out of the Lizard King and Queen Valley of the Dread area. These ones probably dislike the Yuan-Ti intensely, so these are lizard folk that would have been pressing into the jungle to get away from, the Yuan-Ti who were trying to make them slaves. And it would be their descendants, probably not them. And this is where I think you would find lizard folk, working with people, and being more integrated parts of the world. They've been there for a very long time. People have gotten used to them. They're probably having some spats with the lobster people, but that happens. Most likely fighting with lizard folk, because lizard folk would find lobster people to be super tasty. So, that's they aren't picky eaters, right? Meanwhile, in the southern areas, so this is down, towards, this is east of the Orlungo River. This is where things are bad, and people probably hate them. They've remained under the influence of the Yuan-Ti and or the Lizard Kings and Queens, and these are the monstrous lizard folk that we're more used to seeing in D&D, who are out hunting people 24/7, and are just generally bad news. And this would be especially bad because, if the Lizard King and Queen Old Lore perpetuates forwards, that means that every day they need to be presented with a human to eat, and if they don't get it, they're going to eat 2 lizard folk. And lizard folk, even if they're under S1E6 influences, they probably don't want to be eaten. Just probably don't want to be eaten. So that makes that whole area a literal nightmare to navigate through. This is it's north of Samrach, and is the primary land route into Chult proper. Mostly because the Samrach has some serious mountains and illusions and a whole bunch of other nightmare stuff going on. And so anybody coming in through that region is at serious risk of being hunted to be eaten by Lizardfolk. Not a case of like, oh yeah, we trespassed on their land, they got into a fight, they ate Bob, but like literally hunted. Like Lizardfolks, their scouts spot them or their sentries spot them, and now it's complex ambush time. Good luck, adventurers. So yeah, maybe try to avoid that part of the jungle. And now, Lizardfolk were added to the location by the Yuan-Ti. They're not native to it. They're native to other parts of the realms where the Suruk created them and just sort of left them to see what would happen. But Chult and the Chult Peninsula are an amazing environment for them. It is literally everything they're looking for. It's hot, it's damp, there's lots of swamps, there's lots of deltas, there's rivers, there's jungles. It is just a fantastic location for them to eat, live, and breathe. And they're also intelligent, and even though they're seldom treated as such, and are likely to realize that formal alliances and treaties are a good way to survive without having to fight 24/7 to maintain your lands. Groups that I could see them very easily going into alliance with are wild elves. Wild elves don't care about swamps. They're all about giant trees and probably have some pretty wicked like Ewok style villages and stuff going on, hidden deep in the jungle. And making friends with the Lizardfolk who live in the swamps down around the base of those trees would be a fantastic relationship, because for the Lizardfolk, they don't have to worry about things attacking them from up high, and they know that aside from getting water, the elves aren't interested in anything down there. Meanwhile, the elves get the bonus of getting to live with the very secure knowledge that if anything does manage to damage the trees or try to cut them down, that it is serious enough that they should probably just evacuate and not fight it, because it just fought through a tribe of Lizardfolk. Other groups they may get along well with, humans for one. I could see them getting along quite well with different villages in Chult itself, and that's if you're adding villages, which is something that I personally think that you should do, because the book that talks about how the jungle is claustrophobic and terrifying because there's no respite from it. Personally, I think that things are more terrifying if there's false respite. So if the players can think they're safe for a bit, but in reality they are in just as much danger, if not more, because now they're in an isolated spot that is known. I think that's scarier. There's more potential for psychological drama of things like running their claws along the outsides of buildings and stuff like that. But Lizardfolk, I think, would get along well with different human groups, provided they could come up with some sort of territorial division. And I think that would be the big thing with most Lizardfolk, if you're looking to integrate them into your game and have them be in alliance with humans or dwarves or elves or anything else like that. It's that they need territory, and they need specific types of territory that can sustain them and will allow them to maintain their population and grow at a respectable rate. And so any agreements they would come into would likely involve those sorts of aspects, and not having those would be an issue. So if you're looking to add them in, that would most likely be something that will come up. Like the adventurers arrive in town, like, okay, welcome to Umbala. So let's pretend Umbala still exists. Anyways, welcome to Umbala. These are our lands. We're up here on the cliffs and blah 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 blah. Down to the down by the shorelines, and then to the south is the lands of the Lizardfolk. They're our allies. If you're going to go through their lands, you can travel through. Don't kill anything. Bring all your own food, or bring gifts of food to them when you go through, that sort of thing. And yeah, like that's my general take on Lizardfolk. I think that they're awesome. I think that they have a lot of potential as player characters and as a force in the realms and on the Chult Peninsula. But I just really honestly believe that they're not being given a fair shake, largely because for so long, the perception of them is that they were simply a green, scaly-skinned pop-up target for adventurers to encounter. You know, you were having an adventure in a swamp. You didn't want to have to explain why there were swamp orcs after last week's desert orcs debacle. So you toss some lizardfolk in there and call it a day. They're also one of the least human-looking of the playable races, which I think is another reason why people tend to, or not why people, why in official sources they tend to back away from them, which again I think is unfortunate because they look really cool and they embrace Dragonborn, which, like, come on, really? Have one but not the other? Anyways, so that is my take on Lizardfolk. Their lore, their information, they're deeply connected with the Sruk, and I honestly think that if you take some of this lore, take some of this information, and apply it to them, that, you know, not only will your own characters be cooler, but your campaigns and your adventures in this area will be, you know, demonstrably improved. And next week we're continuing with the scaled races with the Terror from Above, the Terrafolk. Yeah, there's some stuff going on with them. There's some really cool stuff, some really terrifying stuff, and I mean, there's a whole mountain range named after them that you should really not go near. So that is next week's episode. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Lore Diver, a POCGamer podcast. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe, and, you know, tell your friends about it. If you want to read more, head over to my blog, POCGamer.com, and check out POCGamer on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you'd like to give me some support, it'd be much appreciated. And there's links to coffee on my blog and on my social media. Music was provided by purple-planet.com. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.